All right. I welcome you again to the UNU-INWEH public event, the Science Talk. For those joining us for the first time, welcome. We are glad you can make it in today. Thank you. I am your host, Professor Grace Oluwasonya. Before presenting our distinguished speaker for this morning, or afternoon, or evening, wherever you logged in from, please note that there will be an interactive Q&A session at the end of the presentation. At that point, there will be room for comments, Q&A, and any other contributions you may have. Please type your questions or comments in the Q&A chat box, and we will pick them up from there. Thank you. Also, please note that all our previous science talks can be viewed on demand on our YouTube channel available at unu.edu/INWEH/science talks. Again, unu.edu/INWEH/science talk. The topic for today's talk is re-engineering our approach to healthy and sustainable communities. So let's talk. Our distinguished speaker is Dr. Kerry Black. I've been blessed to have very beautiful people presenting in this science talk. So Dr. Kerry Black is an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in Integrated Knowledge, Engineering and Sustainable Communities at the UNU-INWEH, University of Calgary, here in Canada. Our research spans a cross-disciplinary platform, incorporating civil and environmental engineering principles and research with policy and socioeconomic components, focusing on sustainable infrastructure for healthy and resilient communities. For the past 15 years, she has worked extensively in the academia, public, private, and nonprofit sectors in various technical, scientific, policy, and management roles. She is currently a professorial chair in Integrated Knowledge and Sustainable Communities at Calgary, like I said before. So let's meet Dr. Kerry Black, my beautiful Dr. Kerry Black. Kerry.
Thank you very much for that wonderful welcome, and welcome to everybody who's joining now or in the future, depending on when you're watching this. My name is Kerry Black. I'm a professional engineer and an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair at the University of Calgary. I'm also a UNESCO co-chair holder in mountain water sustainability. I'm going to chat with you today a little bit about how we might think about re-engineering our approach to healthy and sustainable communities. And if you've been listening along to a lot of the science talks, this might look and feel a little bit different. I tend to talk a little bit more about process and how we do things as opposed to just the outcomes that can emerge from that. And that's because I think that there's a lot of innovation that can be done within the space of that process period. And so not necessarily just the technological innovations or what science is telling us, but how we actually do the science. And that's kind of where I'm going to focus in on today. I want to start first by acknowledging that I am currently located in southern Alberta, which is the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7. Here in a Canadian context, Indigenous communities from across the coast to coast to coast have called this land home since time immemorial. In particular, where I'm located is Treaty 7 territory, which was signed over 150 years ago. And it is home to the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is a beautiful territory comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations here in southern Alberta. Tsuut'ina Nation, which is just located south of the city where I currently call home. And just west of the city is the Iyarhe Nakota, or the Stoney Nakota Nations, which is Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. First Nations call this land home, but also I pay my respects to the Métis Nation Districts 5 and 6, Métis people also calling southern Alberta home and all of Canada home. As a non-Indigenous person, it's really important for me to make that acknowledgement, and I acknowledge all of the locations and places and spaces that you are calling in from or listening in from today. I share a little bit first about who I am because I think it's really important to position the self in everything that we do. And often we just jump right into the science. This is who I am and this is what I do. And we've really focused on the what I do as scientists, but we're heavily informed and biased in a good and bad way by our experiences and where we've grown up and what we've been exposed to. So I'll just share a little bit of that before I kind of dive into a little bit of how we're doing things differently. I'm a civil engineer by training. I work in water and wastewater primarily, but I wasn't always interested in water and wastewater. I knew I wanted to do something where I could impact the health and well-being of people. So for many of us, that means focusing in a little bit on the health profession and thinking about being a doctor. And I had a wonderful mentor while I was doing my engineering degree who said to me, that so long as I was on the medical side, that I would be helping people, absolutely, but I'd be dealing with problems once they've already occurred. And that if I really wanted to make a difference, that engineering could be a way and a tool to stop those problems from happening in the first place. And it was really one of those big aha moments that allows you to think, can I actually change the world with a tool like engineering in a way that maybe I didn't think that I could? And that's lended itself to research for me in a lot of ways, but not traditional research, not necessarily sitting in the lab, although we all, I think, have lots of experience working in the lab if we're researchers. But it really is focusing more on community-driven work and really working grassroots with individuals and communities and organizations that are experiencing issues related to water, wastewater, and infrastructure. And those are the kinds of experiences that I'm going to share today. And all of them, I think you'll see, are very much health focused. And that's because one of the premises and assumptions that I've made and that we make from an engineering perspective in our research group is that engineering is a social determinant of health. The physical environment is a social determinant of health. Infrastructure is a social determinant of health. And that really allows you to rethink how you're approaching many of these problems with the lens to constantly focusing in on the health and well-being of the individuals that you are meant to serve. I'm going to start first with a little bit of context. So in a Canadian context, we are regarded around the world as having very high quality of life, health and well-being. That's changed somewhat, a little bit over the last decade or so, but we're often in that top 10 range, ranging from fourth in 2013 to 12th in 2016 to 13th in 2020. And a lot of these factors that enter into how do we determine, health and well-being, how do we determine happiness of a country, how do we determine how individuals are doing? We look at a bunch of different factors. And I think it's really important to look at these individually: social supports, income, cultural factors, education, employment, experiencing racism, your living conditions, your access to services, and your physical environment. And a highlight there at the bottom, the role of the physical environment and the built environment. But I also highlight the connection that each of these have, whether directly or indirectly, to notions of infrastructure, or specifically water, and how access to water, or adequate access to safe, clean drinking water and sanitation, because those things we know go hand in hand, impacts each of these items. So when I don't have access to safe, clean drinking water or sanitation, I have direct impacts to income, direct impacts to access to education, direct impacts to employment opportunities. And obviously that speaks to our living conditions and our physical environment, but they are all so interrelated. And in a lot of these studies and assessments, we consider them separately. But we know that individuals who don't experience adequate access to safe, clean drinking water and sanitation tend to not be able to access education in the same ways, or not perform as well in their educational systems, not attend as regularly, particularly for women and girls across the globe. And so if we look at them individually, that's one thing. But when we start to layer them and we start to see that there's so many things that come down to having access to adequate infrastructure, and the built environment that I, as an engineer, am responsible for, the weight of that really starts to hit you. And I think that's where I've spent a lot of time focusing in on. How does engineering and the way in which I approach engineering impact each of these items? And as engineers, and whether it's locally here in a Canadian context or globally, are not often taught how to think about these things outside the box. How do we think about, how does an engineer think about access to education when they're designing a water treatment plant? But if we don't make those linkages, it really limits the way in which our technological innovations can proceed. So I want you to think of those for a second, and I'm going to put some different numbers up on the screen. So we saw in 2016 for Canada that we had 12th. That's generalized across the whole population. And I've got some different numbers here. And the first assumption that people make is that I've left the Canadian context, right? I've left Canada now. I've gone somewhere else where I don't have those same levels of support or access. When in fact, these numbers are still in Canada. And I think it's really important for us to understand globally that even a country such as Canada, that's considered to have infinite access to clean, safe drinking water, really does struggle when it comes to looking outside the averages. And what we're seeing here, 52nd, 42nd, and 78th, are the same rankings for health and well-being, but not of the general population. So this is generally across all Indigenous people. Then we have First Nations, and then we have First Nations living on reserve. And that means that we have a major, major gap in issue. Now, obviously, these are 2016 numbers. They have not really evolved since this time in a great degree because there are major issues in the same components that we just talked about. But for me, a big piece and a linkage as we start to look not just here in Canada, but across the globe, is how these numbers tend to shift when we don't have access to safe, clean drinking water. And that's really important to make that connection because engineering is a public health intervention. It's not a separate entity. The science that we do is a public health intervention when we think about it and make that connection. It's very real. And so I highlight these numbers because there is an inequity that exists even within a Canadian context. It's important to understand if we want to be able to address these water challenges in a different way. But I want to make the stronger connection to health here because these are all metrics of health and well-being and how individuals across the globe are doing. And these are still Canadian numbers, and it's important for us to see that. One of the other ways that we can also look at it is through environmental performance index. And these are just a few years old, so they're not as recent. But it's important to highlight that we're still looking in the context of the Canadian systems. And these environmental performance index are another way that we can look at problems. They're less focused on necessarily individual health and well-being, and they're more focused on where is our environmental health currently at. And there's a metric for unsafe sanitation and unsafe drinking water. And these are Canadian numbers I also want to highlight. And they're a way to spot problems, whether or not we're on target. Are we observing some trends? Do we understand, generally speaking, what's happening? And these numbers are, I think, really important to look at really closely because we have a very clear problem. Our rank as Canadians really starts to go down because we have difficulty in ensuring that those living in rural, remote, and in particular Indigenous communities and in the Arctic have access to adequate sanitation and drinking water and adequate wastewater treatment in place. And so this notion now that Canadians are well off when it comes to water and sanitation starts to be debunked because of these numbers that show that while we may do well on an aggregate, we're not doing well at some of those extremes and some of those locations that we're not captured when we report on aggregate. And it's important to look at those numbers, and we'll come back to that in a second. But we'll talk a little bit about this growing divide that exists between Canadian Indigenous communities and water and health. And I say growing because even though we've spent a lot of time attempting to improve that, and I say we as not largely as non-Indigenous peoples and governments have tried in some respects, we have a long, long way to go into fixing that divide that exists currently. And so we saw that in those numbers that dropped from 12th to 42nd and 52nd and 78th. Well, we have to explore exactly why this is occurring. And again, it's not necessarily something that you would think right off the bat is a science or is engineering, but it's very much at the roots of the tree in the way in which we approach engineering and the way in which we approach science. And if we don't understand the framing of how we're doing science and engineering, we're always going to fall short of meeting some of these objectives. When we look globally at the UN recognized right to drinking water and sanitation, there's 5 words that are often put in there. And so we have affordable, accessible, acceptable, sufficient, and safe. And we often tend to focus on water quality as a metric of whether or not individuals have access to adequate water. But quantity is a huge piece of that. And I think over the last few science talks, we've heard from individuals who are experts in hydrology and understanding impacts to water quantity in a Canadian context. And there are major issues that we're all starting to see and exhibit across the country, not just here in Canada, across the globe. How are those going to impact those that are most vulnerable are the questions that our research is asking, not necessarily where our focus tends to be, which is large urban centers, and those are very much important. But when we already are seeing inequities in rural and remote communities, these impacts to water quantity are going to have a much starker impact than they would in an urban center. And it's important to think about that in the context of the UN human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, because it's not just about having adequate quality, it's about having adequate quantity. And then it's also about ensuring that it continues to be accessible, affordable, and acceptable. We'll come back to a few other words that we're going to explore, and recently in a few community engagements, we start to ask, what are the questions that come to you, or the comments and the words that come to you when we think about clean water? And up on the screen, you have a diversity of words. And certainly you can see that I have some that would be, deemed more technical, unit processes of water treatment, for example, the chemicals that we're using, the distribution network or lack thereof, depending on where we're talking about, the importance of source water protection, how we're sizing pipes. We have people that get into the weeds of the technical or traditionally technical. And then we have other elements that come up. We have elements of adequate funding and equity and the stakeholders that are involved and the end users that are involved in drinking that water and the relationships that we have with water and our role in protecting the land and words like rights. And all of a sudden, we take what many would deem a very technical topic of how we can clean water to a certain regulation or standard. And we've now exploded that in the sense that we have to think about all of these other pieces that impact our approach to clean water. In the Canadian context, this inequity, as I said before, has become greater, but it's exacerbated by the fact that we struggle not just with drinking water. So the focus nationally and internationally has been on drinking water. The focus has less so been on sanitation, and we have a major ticking time bomb of sanitation issues here in the Canadian context for rural and remote communities. That's what research is telling us. That's what data is telling us. That's what the world is telling us. But we're not necessarily doing anything about it just yet. And we also have other exacerbating built environment issues. We have overcrowded housing, major issues with respect to housing. And then if we think about the built environment past that with respect to infrastructure, we have issues in adequate access to healthcare, internet, telecommunications. Those are impacting education. For Indigenous populations in Canada, we have higher rates of disease and unemployment, incarceration and suicide, drug-related deaths. Now, I don't want to frame that from a deficit lens because it's important to understand that there are a tremendous amount of initiatives that are being led by Indigenous peoples in Canada that are contributing to improvements in health and well-being. But I think it's really important for us to understand that this is still a big part of the reality that exists in a Canadian context. And for me, bringing that back to the connection that it has to infrastructure and the built environment is where we spend a lot of our time focusing right now, because a lot of these impacts are direct outcomes of inadequate access to adequate infrastructure and the built environment. I'm going to share a couple emerging trends from what we're looking at with respect to well-being. And indicators of well-being, we look across different populations in a Canadian context and globally. And what we're seeing now through some of these trends is an interesting trend emerging with respect to rurality and remoteness. So if you live in a location that's more rural or remote, and we're making very direct connections between an individual's well-being and their access to water. So as access to water improves, well-being improves. And it's a logical connection that we've made globally, not necessarily one that we've made very clearly in a Canadian context. And that's because we have made some pretty big assumptions that because Canadians have access to water, therefore, we don't necessarily have to look at this as deeply. We tend to look at this in a global context in places of water scarcity and water stress. This connection to well-being and that direct connection to access to water is so much more heightened as we get to more rural and remote contexts. And these numbers are from a comparison of First Nations community data versus non-Indigenous community data. And we see a very direct codependency between water and infrastructure and wellness indicators. And these are the R-square values that are connecting the connection between each of those elements. So access to water and infrastructure measured through different parameters. So we have housing indicators, we have drinking water and sanitation indicators, and then we have general wellness indicators that are taken for nationally across the population. It's done not every year, but it's done regularly. And so we see a very direct codependency there between wellness and water and infrastructure. We see that when one declines, the other declines as well. So as water and infrastructure has declined, we've seen a decrease in well-being. So we've compared data sets from 2010 and 10 years later and seen that when we see a decline in the water infrastructure indicators, so the quality of the access to that, we see a direct response in wellness indicators. And keep in mind, those wellness indicators are not just tied to that one parameter. They're tied to a lot of parameters similar to the ones that I presented earlier. But if we take those all out, we still see a very clear codependent relationship between water and infrastructure and wellness. And what we see is that as we live and are looking at more rural and remote contexts, that codependency is that much greater. And it's that much greater for a statistically significant difference for First Nations versus non-Indigenous communities. So Indigenous versus non-Indigenous communities have a much stronger connection to well-being and access to water, and it increases as we get more remote. And what that's telling us is very clearly going back to our conversation about water quantity. If we have impacts that are going to disproportionately affect a certain population, whether those living in rural and remote contexts and First Nations or Indigenous peoples in Canada living in a rural and remote context, the impact to them is not going to be equal to the impact that it would be in an urban setting. It is a disproportionate impact. It is going to be greater and felt greater by those living in rural and remote contexts than it would be in urban settings. And that's really important, and it needs to influence the way in which we approach our policies, because we're not created equal. And these inequities that have persisted for decades will just be that much worse if we don't start to address those underlying causes. That's one piece I want to focus on. And I want to then say, okay, as we've explored our research, we can talk about clean, safe drinking water and sanitation infrastructure from those technical words that you saw earlier. But these are the words that emerge in community-based conversations. It's a very different set of words with respect to what we saw earlier with safe, sufficient, accessible, acceptable, and affordable. When we talk about it at a community level, we're talking about rights, right to water, right to sanitation. We're talking about the importance of community engagement throughout that process, as opposed to something where we provide or we give or we force a solution onto communities. We're asking to work directly with communities. And it's through that engagement that you begin to understand why that connection to water and that direct connection to well-being is that much greater in rural and remote contexts. We're talking about how we can have adequate resources to support that. What it needs to happen in an urban setting is different than in rural and remote. How does that influence our decision making, and how can individuals be engaged within that decision making? How can autonomy be supported and raised up in these processes and coinciding with that self-determination of individual nations and of Indigenous peoples? And where is the priority for rural and remote and vulnerable communities or underserved communities? And that's kind of the focus of where I see the opportunity in really shifting the way that we do science, because science and engineering tends to focus on that aggregate, that norm, that average. And certainly that's important work that needs to be done, but we're forgetting about those that are not captured in those aggregate numbers. I want to pause for a second because in the context that I live right now in Calgary, we've had some pretty major events that have caused national and international news, and they all come down to the built environment and infrastructure. And in a Canadian context, our infrastructure is in major need of repair. And how does this connect to what we previously talked about? I will get there, I promise. Most recently, in the last couple months, we've had major water main breaks here in the city of Calgary. That's impacted individuals in being able to access their water, but no major impacts to health and well-being. No one was hurt or harmed, no one was hospitalized, and there were no deaths. So in the context of the global, it's not necessarily what others might deem as a major issue. But if we take it for a minute in the Canadian context, it was very much a very large issue and has continued to be a focus of the media and of individuals who are worried about the quality of our infrastructure. But our infrastructure, as is the case in largely in North American context, is very detached from people. And as a result, we don't have a connection to infrastructure. And that's one thing. But what we really lack is understanding the role that infrastructure plays in our individual health. And it takes something like a water main break for us to understand the importance of that infrastructure, but it's just as easy for us to forget about it. The words used on the screen here are pulled from 3 different recent reports on the quality of infrastructure in a Canadian context: deteriorating, massive threat, monumental, uncertain, and chronic underinvestment. And we estimate that the infrastructure gap that exists within a Canadian context alone is upwards of 150 billion. Just in Indigenous communities, that number is at least 50 billion, with some reports upwards of 200 billion. And so we have a major, major issue that we have with respect to infrastructure. What we haven't done, though, is connected that to health and well-being. We haven't considered investments in infrastructure as investments in health. And that's a really important shift that needs to happen for us to be able to address what will become a major public health emergency. Because as infrastructure deteriorates to a point of disrepair, we are going to see very clear and real public health emergencies emerge. In fact, when it happened here, a state of local emergency was called, and it's only through these states of local emergency, which are public health emergencies, that we're able really to respond. And so it's starting to have this conversation around the role of infrastructure as an element and a tool of public health. And we don't often want to invest in infrastructure. We don't think that it's a big deal necessarily to spend money on roads that connect us to the hospitals we need to go to, or that the pipes that connect and bring us our safe, clean drinking water that is so critical to our public health. But we're starting to make those connections, but what we need to do is reinforce them. As a result, we've seen major declines in infrastructure investments since about the mid-1950s. Post-war investments in infrastructure really started to decline. At the same time, we are putting greater and greater emphasis on local governments to manage that from a public health perspective, which is a major shift. When we look at health funding in a North American context, we see a provincial or a state level investments in health. We see major federal investments in health. And at the local side, it's a very different context. But in infrastructure, we've not kept up with that. So we approach infrastructure funding very differently than we do health. And that is a major problem because infrastructure is health. And that's the connection that we're trying to make. This is an example of another more recent infrastructure challenge that occurred on a major connecting point from Western Canada to the rest of Canada and the lower mainland in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, where we had a major infrastructure failure. So our wonderful hydrologists who I work with all the time, we design physical structures to support water. And when those physical structures fail, this is the result. And so we had a major disruption in services, and think about the very real and direct impacts to health and well-being. So no longer having access to safe drinking water, no longer having access to sanitation, no longer having access to roads to connect you to health systems, to food, to access additional water. The connection of this transportation corridor also having direct and real implications from a health-based perspective in being able to access important resources. And so what we're trying to do in the context of our research is to help pivot the conversation away from I'm building a road, I'm building a clean water treatment plant, I'm thinking about technological innovations in that space, to having a conversation about how we're framing the problem to begin with, and reframing the problem from a health-based perspective, and therefore re-engineering how we approach healthy and sustainable communities. And we're really asking ourselves, what's the role of water and infrastructure in that reconnection, in our community building, and in our health and well-being? And that's where I think we're seeing some really interesting trends emerge, like what we were showing earlier, and what we want to do now is connect that to policy and decision making, make a stronger connection to policy and decision makers on infrastructure as that social determinant of health. So in the last 10 minutes here, I'll explore a little bit about how we're doing it differently and how we need to be doing it differently. And the biggest one that I think you will see here is a recognition that equity and access with respect to infrastructure in the built environment is not created equal. It's also not created equal on a national scale, is what I really want to reinforce. So whereas Canadians may be looking abroad to looking for areas of inequity, we can look here at home. We can look in our own backyards and see inequity and issues with access with respect to infrastructure and water and sanitation. So we really want to reinforce the role of infrastructure as a social determinant of health and well-being. The second piece that's on here is a recognition that, and this is a very Canadian context that I will share right now, is that inequity that we shared earlier with respect to lack of comparability between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities, or issues of substantive equality, we can say, is directly related to a path to reconciliation that Canadians, and not just Canadians, certainly other governments like Australia and New Zealand have made the same commitments to working more closely with Indigenous populations within those areas, recognizing the harm that has been done for years. And one of the big pieces that has emerged over the last 4 years in particular is a recognition through a class action settlement agreement that Canada did harm to Indigenous peoples by not adequately providing safe drinking water and sanitation. And that's something that happened in 2021 here in the Canadian context. Not long after, it took Canada a very long time to acknowledge the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation. Once we finally did that, we were able to have more meaningful conversations about our role in impacting people's health and well-being by systematically ensuring they did not have access to safe, clean drinking water and sanitation. That's what the class action settlement agreement has determined. And that's a really important piece for us to highlight in very recent history in Canada, is recognizing that we have a role to play in people's health and well-being, and that colonialism and repression can occur through means of limiting people's access to safe, clean drinking water. We see this globally right now. It's a tool and a mechanism to oppress, and we've seen that very much here in a Canadian context in our very recent history. And that's, again, important for us as engineers and scientists to understand that our role within that space is directly connected to a very recent history, and our role is ensuring that we can continue on that path of reconciliation to ensure that equity and access is the same for all across Canada and across the globe. We also see that as soon as we start to make those connections between infrastructure and our health and well-being, we're fostering reconnection with those elements, and we're fostering a greater community and understanding around the importance that this infrastructure has to our health and well-being. And that allows individuals, and what we've seen at individual community level, and specifically in the context that I work within, is with First Nations living on reserve, is that when we start to make those connections with the infrastructure, we see an immediate reconnection to people in place, an immediate connection to cultural values and immediate reconnection to the environment. And that fosters that autonomy and self-determination. It fosters a different relationship with water, one that I think we as non-Indigenous people need to start to understand better, because it's only through that reconnection with infrastructure that we're going to start to prioritize that. And it's through that that I think when we talk about building resilience of communities, and we talk about resilience to climate change, we talk about resilience with respect to the changes that are occurring globally, not just related to necessarily to climate change, but a lot of other change that we're seeing nationally and internationally. That resilience is going to be founded on individuals. So we can make communities resilient. We can make infrastructure resilient. We can put in all the checks and balances to ensure from a scientific perspective that we've got it handled. But if we don't build that resilience and reconnect it at the individual level, we're always going to fall short of that resilience, because that's where really we've seen globally in times of national disasters. Yes, the built environment is important, absolutely, but it's our connection of individuals to that built environment that is critical to ensuring that we have that resilience. So how do we do it better? We highlight the fact that technology is not always the answer, and that's a hard piece for me as a engineer to say, because that's really the focus of a lot of the work that we do, right? It's technology focused approaches, but we have to acknowledge there's an inherent vulnerability in focusing strictly on technology. We need to bookend that technological innovation process and understand better how we're developing the technologies and how it's impacting people. Did we develop them in an inclusive way? So having a more inclusive approach, getting away from a monoculture of environmental management and infrastructure design. What we see is once something works well one place, we're going to try and duplicate and replicate it across. And the reality is the context that we live in is vastly different as we move around. As we go from urban to rural to remote, it's a very different context, as we've seen in some of the previous slides. So it's important that our approach also shifts in that context, that we understand what's happening locally, so that we can apply appropriate solutions or work more closely with individuals at that scale. There's always a focus on developing appropriate solutions. What's the appropriate technology? What's the appropriate solution? And really, that terminology of appropriate, we're starting to do away with and looking more at contextually relevant. So contextually relevant technological solutions, contextually relevant science is what we need to be doing, as opposed to just focusing on what we think might be inappropriate. So we start to really reframe and change the process that we do it. When we do this through a community lens, we allow community to prioritize their objectives and goals and outcomes. We're engaging directly with people. There's community input at all stages. You're going to be sensitive to local values and practices. It's a lengthier time period, so our research and science takes longer when we work with community, and that's a good thing from a community perspective and an outcome perspective, even though oftentimes science wants us to move a little bit faster. We focus on verbal and oral traditions because there's a tremendous amount of knowledge carried, particularly by First Nations people and Indigenous people in Canada, that is carried through story and narrative, and understanding that that is science. That is very much science, and it needs to start influencing the way in which Western individuals approach their science. We provide a deeper understanding and we look at local expertise. We start to bring all of these pieces together, and all of a sudden we are very much doing things in a very different way. It looks and feels very different, place-based. So in one location, it's going to be very different than another location, and that's important. And it's important to acknowledge, but it's also important to acknowledge not just that we're doing things differently, but it's leading to very different outcomes for communities. So in the approach that we have with the research that we do is that we are allowing, and not allowing is not the right word, but we're facilitating a space for community-based infrastructure solutions. These solutions can lead to lower cost and more sustainable options for water wastewater management, for example. We're allowing for that prioritization of their individual infrastructure challenges and engineering challenges. We're looking at ways that we can facilitate that access and bridge the gap between research and practice. And we're having a better understanding of what the actual issues are. So it's very typical for science and research to say, this is what the problem is, let's focus on the solutions. What we're trying to do is say, maybe this isn't the problem. maybe this is actually not the framing of the problem that we needed to do. And we're empowering communities to lead those discussions and lead that problem reframing. It's a very much a concept on social innovation. First step of social innovation is allowing for problem reframing. Are we certain that we're tackling the problem that we think is the problem? Are we certain that that's actually the issue that we should be addressing? So community involvement and consent is critical throughout the process. There's cultural sensitivity and appropriateness, recognizing that we can't have a pan-Indigenous approach across Canada. We can't have a pan-global approach, as we've seen for decades in international development work. We know we can't just go into one community and assume that what we did, even just down the road is going to work within that context. So it's very sensitive to what's going on in a specific context. It's really focused on relationship building. You don't often hear engineering researchers or scientists talking about relationship building, but that's the important piece that is critical to the success of this kind of work. We're focusing on reciprocity and engaging back and forth. So it's not just a one-way street, a reflexivity and adaptation. So we're evolving over time. And that's part of the social innovation spectrum of this research is what we start out understanding shifts and changes as we move forward. And then we're really looking at dissemination and ownership of how we move forward. And it's not just we take this work and we publish a paper, it's that we allow communities to be the ones to disseminate their work, and they're the owners, ultimate owners of the work that they're doing, but also shifting the way that we actually present that information, because the large number of Canadians, Indigenous or non, are not reading journal papers. And so how is that impacting, again, understanding that the individual has such an important role in building resilience and community resilience? How can we ensure that we're having the right conversations with the right people and not necessarily just filling journal books and journal articles within that space? And so that's a big part of the approach. When we do this, obviously, we have increased community participation. We can often reduce costs of solutions that are actually applied. We see a sustainability long term, so coming back and seeing solutions that are still in place. We're fostering that reconnection and ownership and participation and empowerment. We're approaching problems differently, not as professors or as engineers or as scientists, but as facilitators or collaborators, not as all-knowing. In the context of working with Indigenous people here in Canada, we're repairing damage from bad engineering and bad science, and we're rebuilding trust. We're focusing on Indigenous science and Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, as opposed to Western ways. And we're recognizing that under all of this is a conversation on rights. And the reality is you can't be a water researcher and not have a context of the political. You can't be a water engineer and not have an understanding of rights. It is inherent in everything that we do, but we don't necessarily take that into account because we other it. We think of it as other than what we're doing, when in fact it's very much at the base and the roots of everything that we're doing. Some of the places where we're focusing in on right now to help shift the perspective is working directly with nations on regeneration and resilience projects, looking at how we can invest in Indigenous science as the original sustainability science. So as opposed to coming up with Western ways of understanding the world, we're actually creating space for Indigenous ways of knowing to be leading, because Western ways are arguably taking too long. And so we're looking at facilitating a space, and you see this emerging, pardon me, you see this emerging across the country and also globally, Indigenous peoples really reclaiming the space of their understanding of sustainability as the original science that they've, with decades and hundreds and thousands of years of lived experience, are helping to shape how we approach our environment and our built environment. And so in the built environment side, we're seeing more focuses on natural capital, ecosystem, and land as ecosystem services, and how that can change the way that we approach our infrastructure. So just to close out here, this re-engineering approach is really about looking at how we can be innovative in a different way, how we can do science in a different way, how we reframe the problem, we contextualize it, we look at those hard to reach areas, and in particular, we start looking away from the aggregate and mean. We try to frame things from a user perspective as opposed to a technological perspective or a science perspective. And we start thinking more about the social impact of our design thinking and the social innovation. As the last slide here, I want to just reemphasize the importance that health has in all of this. And we're starting, certainly to make innovations and public health impacts in the ways that we're approaching infrastructure. I think a really interesting example is what emerged post-pandemic, and a focus on looking at our wastewater as informing us on our global public health. And we've, in Canadian context, have started doing a lot more of this wastewater monitoring in Indigenous communities in particular as a tool for them, as a public health tool for them to assess their community health and well-being. But all of a sudden, wastewater, which for years and decades has been considered something of no value, has tremendous value from a public health perspective in telling us how we're doing. I think it's really important to sort of look into that a little bit more and recognize that we've been trying to get wastewater monitoring in cities and globally and not just here locally and nationally, but globally as well for years. But it never got any traction because there was no impetus, there was no pressure for it to do so. COVID, not a lot of people share a lot of great things about COVID, but COVID was a great thing for wastewater monitoring because it allowed people to see that our wastewater is actually a very important public health tool. And that's, I think, starting to shift the conversation that we're having around infrastructure as a public health intervention. And that's really kind of the closing piece or comment that I want to share with today. I end with something that's really important and close to my heart. So in a Canadian context, most recently, a very notable Indigenous Canadian, Murray Sinclair, passed away. And I've used this quote for many, many, many years, that innovation isn't always about creating new things. Innovation sometimes involves looking back to our old ways and bringing them forward to a new situation. And I think that's really what our work over the last 5 to 10 years has started to show, is really that we don't necessarily need to innovate all the time new technologies, but innovate the way in which we're doing things, and be open to the fact that innovation has already existed. We just weren't looking at it. So I will end there and say thank you for your attention.
Kerry, thank you. When it takes me a while like this to put my thoughts together, it just means that, a lot of things really caught my attention. And I guess I'll start by saying I'm happy really to see the day that a core engineer will start with, will talk the way you just did, or advocate the way you just did, and they angle the perspective the way you just did. It's really interesting for me. When I started out in this space, engineers are so, so engineers in their thinking. So for me, it's a huge shift. It's a huge thing, to still be able to, in my lifetime, really see this is brilliant. This is great. I guess that's the first comment I'll put out there. And a few of the phrases or the terms that came out, indigenous intelligence, that's also another brilliant thing. Because like you said from your last slide, innovation is not always about, do something new, artificial intelligence, like that. It's, yes, true. We cannot always use yesterday's, science or solutions to meet today's challenges because of dynamics, changes, and all that. But again, it makes sense to also look back and see, every community has a level of intelligence, native intelligence. It is there. We only need to just go back and tap into it. But okay, let's shift back now to, a mix of science and all that. My first reaction will be one of the comments you made. Now, research will take longer because we're advocating for co-consultation, with the community. How does the research funders feel about this? is there been a shift in that angle? Because these are some of the things that put researchers, in a fix, that they just want to keep going. You need to look, at where the money is coming from. So your reaction?
Well, you're going to get me in trouble, Grace. Has it shifted? Sort of, I'll say, but not enough to acknowledge that these things take time. So our funding cycles, the way in which we approach just grant writing, and then the way we approach the outcomes from that hasn't shifted enough to allow for that co-creation to occur. It has encouraged, in the same way, it's actually very interesting. I think the granting process in many ways mimics what we see in infrastructure projects, which is our funding streams cater to shovel ready. And in the context of grants, it caters to project ready. And in the working with communities, you can't have shovel ready necessarily. You can't have project ready grants and funding. You need to have funds that encourage and support the co-creation of what it is that you're even going to do. That's, for one, not encouraged in a funding process. Now, some of the granting agencies have really started to shift, and they get that they need to do it differently, but it's very hard to connect that with the research institutions that are still very much focused on outputs. And so looking at metrics of success for researchers is still, despite the fact that we've signed on, many institutions in Canada and North America have signed on to the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA, we're still not seeing that translate into the way in which we're valued and reviewed and assessed. We're not necessarily seeing that reflected then in terms of how the institutions are run. So we have, I think both sides know that we have to do it differently, and both are maybe looking at each other, research institutions looking at funding agencies and funding agencies looking at research institutions and saying, we need to do this differently. But no one's really forcing the hand of the other just yet. And so it's really where it's at right now is it's on the backs of people who do research differently to just take that risk, to acknowledge this is what I'm going to do. If it doesn't yield the outcomes and the outputs that people expect, that's just the way it's going to be. And we'll figure that out when the time comes. When your grant comes to an end and you haven't produced the outputs or outcomes that you said you would, you're going to make a very real acknowledgement of the delays in that research. I mean, one really good example is wastewater monitoring post-COVID. And, most of the communities that we work with are facing major health epidemics, not just related to COVID-19. And so when you're going into communities and that have chronic underfunding of infrastructure, ongoing health-related epidemics, this is post-pandemic, and you're saying, hey, we should really do a project on wastewater monitoring. There are so many other important pieces there than the research that we're doing as, from research institutions or as academics, that you're not going to get that buy-in right away, for one. The other piece that's really important is that funding agencies, although they want to, they don't necessarily support the use of funds in new and creative ways. And so we fund in our research, we fund community-based researchers. And these are individuals who are not doing a master's or PhD by the Western notion, but they are very much engaged in the project and the research. And they're considered equal, if not more important, than the highly qualified personnel, or that's the word we use here, HQP. They're considered as important as those individuals who are doing master's and PhD, because they're bringing a tremendous amount of knowledge to the table. Funding agencies don't necessarily want to fund that either. So there's a lot of change that needs to happen. It's starting to happen, but I would say the current funding cycles, the current granting process still has a long way to go to show how it can support doing research in a different way.
Okay, thank you. I kind of expected that response. Another bottleneck that I think one needs to look into is the core engineers, those the traditional engineers. So how do you navigate that space? Because I'm sure there's yes, it creates a lot of narration and all that, but are they really yielding, or what do you see in your experience right now?
So, locally, or sorry, I'll say nationally, Professional Engineers of Canada thinking more North American, certainly American Society of Civil Engineers and the engineering profession south of the border here and globally, they're starting to recognize there's a major change that needs to happen. And this actually, I wouldn't say just starting. They started maybe 10 years ago at looking at how we train engineers. How can we, it used to be that, and sort of probably still is, but many people would make assumptions about engineers, not great communicators, not individuals that really understand the context, not necessarily individuals who understand the social side or the social impacts of their work. And so we're starting to see changes in that, certainly in the way that um, we're trying to change the way in which we train engineers. And that's one aspect. But when you get out to the workforce, that also has to change. So industry recognizes in many respects that the trained engineers that we're getting are great from a technical perspective, but they don't know how to implement it. They don't know how to work within the context that they're in, and that presents a huge number of challenges in terms of the work that they're doing. I've seen shifts, certainly, but I still think that the majority, and you can see it, I always couch my presentation as, oh, this is going to be a little bit different, because people are expecting to see graphs and data and figures, and this is how we're doing science differently, and this is what we're learning about the environment. And we take a step back from that, and certainly we can focus on the outcomes of our work, but it's almost more important still to stay and help people understand that how we're doing things is differently. Majority of people I work with would probably still say this feels very tangential to engineering. This doesn't feel like real engineering. And you just have to accept that in the process of doing things differently, you're going to redefine what a profession is and what it should be. In the same ways that other professions have shifted and evolved over time to redefine how they do things and what they are, engineering is in a process of redefinition. The way in which we do things is needing to change. And it's probably just connecting it closer to the commitments we make as engineers. Every engineer has to take an oath, no matter where you are in the globe, you take an oath, and the oath is founded on protection of public health. Like, it's in there, it's right there for the taking. And yet we don't really understand the role of engineering in public health still. So it's starting to change, but we still have a long way to go, so that people understand that working, at the periphery or the bookends of the technological innovation process is still engineering.
Mm. I'll give you a catch to reframe the role. I believe water managers, engineers were actually at the upstream of public health protection, while medical doctors are the downstream. So if you do our work well, actually, they should at the downstream, have relatively little, to manage. So the onus really lies on us. But I want to give a chance to some of my colleagues. Miriam?
Thank you so much. This is really, really interesting. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more specifically about how you were working with First Nation communities to incorporate oral traditions and anecdotal information. Did you have translators? What was like the on the ground process like?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned before, it's project specific, and some of the communities we work with don't have the same connection to language as they used to have, and that's very much a problem that we've created as non-Indigenous people. So in those cases, we'll often bring individuals to the community to foster reconnection of language. But in the context of some of the communities we work with where language is very important, translators are an absolute must, elders and knowledge keepers, and with that comes a commitment of resources and grant dollars, which again, the funding agencies are sometimes okay with and sometimes less okay with, because it costs a lot of money to bring people together, and to recognize that that's a form of intellectual property that we're acknowledging in the process as well. So translators, absolutely. But some of the things that we do, and I'll give you some examples, just building on some of your more recent science talks where we've talked with a lot of hydrological modelers, for example, we're trying to bring the community voice to that. So we work with a lot of communities where we're remapping understandings of historical water flows through the lens of community input. So we're fostering it through conversations, and we bring elders together and have a conversation. We will trigger it with pictures. So older pictures of a specific community, and we'll ask them to share stories, and they'll emerge with stories that at first glance people might not think as inherently has some of those quantitative metrics into it. But as they talk about their relationship with water, you'll see they're talking about depth of water and flow of water, and they're talking about water quality. And you can start to pull that out and map that into your Western-centric notion of water flows or historical water flows and how you're projecting the future so that you can better integrate that community knowledge. And so elders and knowledge keepers are key. Re-engaging communities in that process who've been disconnected from their waters is a big part of that process. Bringing in translators is an absolute must. And physically going, being there for lengthy periods of time and seeing the land and the community through their lens is a big part of it. And that's, again, as you can see, it takes time and additional resources to be able to do that effectively. And so that's one of the examples. But in every community, we're trying to ensure that we're using processes that encourage the inclusion of different ways of knowing. And so whether it's pictures, words, triggers, we have many instances where we print community maps and we ask people to just identify what did you used to do here and there. And it's, whether they were doing certain kinds of hunting or laying trap lines, that has a direct connection to what may have been occurring on the land at that time that isn't being captured by Western science. So it becomes very visual, very community engaged, participatory approaches, very less so on, going into the stream and collecting hard data.
Okay, Kevin.
I think we're out of overtime already, but I think I just use the opportunity to thank you for the work you're doing and the inspiration you're creating. I think not fitting the traditional boundaries and not doing things as others are doing is tough. It's very challenging, especially in, not only in engineering, but I think more importantly in academia, where there are norms and boundaries and there's a system of peer review that sets the norms. So finding and changing those is not easy. So, of course, we need successful cases to talk about and stories and cases that you share, but also the personal journey is you try to highlight a little bit is also important. It needs to be documented. And, that sort of inspiration, I think, is important. And I hope you share more of that with early career scientists, especially women, and of course, fellow engineers. That's extremely important. And I think in classroom, I hear you also do a great job. They do a great work. And I think we need more and more people who think differently and challenge the current systems if we want to fix the system. Otherwise, our societies push back what the academics have been saying and what those elites in their chambers are trying to say. So because we're over time, I'm not going to ask a question, but just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. On that note, Kerry, as much as I would like you to continue this conversation, we need to wrap this up. Thank you so much for your time. I know it's busy. You're one of the most difficult to get down because we're everywhere, but I'm happy we could eventually get to this point and, you have this opportunity to share this, with us and with the global audience. So on that note, we say thank you again for your time, for the insight into your work, and hopefully very soon we will call you back in again for more insight into your work. Thank you. And
Thanks
to
so much.
everyone who are joining us today, thank you. Hopefully see you next time. Thank you very much.